Great. Okay, over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy that you've all come along and taken time out of your day to join us and hear about our Climate Pig project. I'd like to start by thanking firstly our funders, UKCR, for supporting this project, and also pay some special attention to the Met Office and our main stakeholder partner, Karro Food Group, who have both shared data with us that underpins this work and that I'll be telling you about today. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Kate. So today I'm going to be sharing with you a summary of our project, so what we've been doing over the course of this project, giving you some detailed analysis of each of the 4 work packages, and then sharing some of our key messages before inviting Steve Irwin, who's here from Karro, to offer his stakeholder response to the work that we've done. I'll also be joined by some of my project mates, and hopefully when it comes to Q&A, you'll be able to ask some questions that they'll be able to answer as well. So thank you. On to the next slide, please. So resilient and sustainable livestock production has been a key focus in recent years, and it really represents a substantial gap in our understanding for the development of a future food system. And this is particularly so in relation to climate associated aspects. We've chosen to focus our attention for this particular project on outdoor pig production because it represents, well, firstly 40% of the national breeding herd, but also because pork itself is a major dietary component for the UK and globally as well. So we're really interested in looking at how production efficiency and environmental impacts are affected by changes in climate and also extreme weather events. So this project was born out of very early discussions with stakeholders, particularly Karro, with whom we work very closely, around how we can mitigate against some of these issues. So our aim was really to be able to provide a series of critical improvements to on-farm climate services, and to be able to integrate different kinds of technologies that we might then be able to use towards ensuring that future production in outdoor herds is both sustainable and resilient to variations in climate. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to point out is one of our objectives was really to develop a new way of working. And so what we did here was we brought together a large group of multi and interdisciplinary UK scientists. So we brought together climate scientists, statisticians, modelers, soil scientists, animal scientists and computer scientists to work together with stakeholders from the outset to design a way of looking at this particular problem. And the whole way through, right from the very outset, we were interested to understand what are the barriers to strengthening our understanding of the risks associated with extreme weather for outdoor production. What are the drivers for behaviour change? So how might we encourage changes in farmer decision making, for example, to accommodate this? And what are the implications for how we might communicate and make decisions about future strategies based on the research that we're doing? So the whole way through we've been thinking along those lines. So if we move to the next slide, thank you. So I'll start working my way through each of the different work packages, and I'll preempt this by saying that, you know, as I mentioned, this is work from a large group of scientists all working together on each of the different work packages, but led by different groups. So this first work package on the analysis of climate and production data was led by Shakur Hajat and Hyunju Lee at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And their principal objective was to characterise and quantify short-term associations between climate factors and production performance variables. Next slide, please. So in the first instance, we looked at data from the University of Leeds farm and linked that with ambient temperature and rainfall data from the Met Office station that we have based at the university farm. And because of some of the irregularities in the farrow dates, we were only able in the end to look at this at a monthly level. So we didn't have the resolution that we would ideally like to have, but we were able to look at monthly aggregates in relation to the monthly weather factors. Based on that, we could see that there was very little relationship between gestation time and any of the temperature metrics that we looked at. So the relationship is shown here in the two figures. So in the top graph, we can see that the relationship between temperature and gestation length, the middle line in each figure, represents the estimated relationship, and the dashed lines are the confidence intervals. And so in general, what we saw was very little relationship between gestation length and temperature, as well as other temperature metrics, such as diurnal temperature. We also assessed the relationship with rainfall, and again, there was very little signal from rainfall, and that was also the case when we looked at death rates in relation to temperature and rainfall too. Although I would stress again that these data are at a monthly level, and so we're really losing some of the granularity of the information on temperature and rainfall extremes where we might otherwise expect to see signals. Next slide, please. So we then moved on to look at some of the Karro data from breeding farms in Scotland. And so this slide shows the seasonality of some of the outcomes from one of the farms that we're calling Farm B between 2016 and 2019. So this was one of the farms that had the most complete data available. And what we could see that there was clear seasonality in some of the outcomes that we looked at. So for example, for the average number of piglets weaned per litter, you can see a very clear annual pattern with the numbers peaking in the summer months each year. And for the percentage of deaths in piglets per pre-weaning, there was also seasonality with the percentages being highest in those winter months. And we know that this pattern is something common that we see across the board. We also observed seasonality in the percentage of sows that were farrowed. So next slide, please. So the clearest seasonality we found was shown with the average number of piglets born alive per litter. So again, on this particular farm, there were peaks in the summer months. We then seasonalized the data, so removing the annual patterns and linked it to ambient temperatures. In the case of the numbers, like the number of piglets born alive per litter, we saw that there was a general relationship with the numbers increasing as temperatures increased, and there was some plateauing of the increase at very high temperatures as well. Generally, this was consistent with a linear relationship between our two variables, and so we estimated that there was perhaps a small increase in live born numbers per 1 degree increase in temperature. We found that this was statistically significant. However, this was most apparent only in this particular farm, so Farm B. And when we looked at the other farms, we found that there wasn't quite the same level of seasonality in most of the outcomes that we looked at. And so consequently, there was very little relationship overall with the weather factors that we were investigating, so primarily temperature, but also rainfall. Next slide, please. So on to work package 2. And in this work package, we were looking at conducting a pilot study of different types of diets that could be used to reduce the environmental impact of extreme weather events and ultimately increase climate resilience in sows. So we know that sows can be heat stressed when temperatures get high, and so we were looking to see whether diet can help to mitigate against that. So this work was led at the University of Leeds Research Farm, and it was led by Katie McDermott, Stephen Laird, George Sorensen, Helen Miller, and Pippa Chapman. So next slide, please. So we had 4 different diets that we tested in this scenario. So we had a control diet, which was a standard lactation diet. We had a high protein diet with standard energy. We had a high energy diet that had standard amount of protein but high amounts of energy, and we had a high protein and high energy diet as well. So 4 different diets in total. And we fed gilts and sows with one of these diets for 4 weeks during the lactation period. A new batch then entered the farrowing pens, and in total we looked at 7 batches equating to 187 animals in total. And we looked at the impact of these diets on litter performance, on faecal nutrient output, and on soil nutrient content. Next slide, please. So the weather conditions we were most interested in were those resulting in heat stress for the animals. In lactating pigs, periods of heat stress will have considerable effects on the animal's behaviour. She will increase her respiration rate, spend more time drinking and wallowing, which can damage soils, spend less time feeding her litter and reduce the amount of food she eats. A useful measure of heat stress is the temperature humidity index, and an increase in both temperature and humidity will reduce the pig's ability to cool through heat exchange in the skin. So previous work that's been conducted in Yorkshire has shown really clearly that outdoor pigs experience heat stress above a THI of roughly 20 degrees. And so we hypothesised that by feeding an energy-dense, more digestible diet, we could partially ameliorate the negative impact of heat stress, as such a diet would be linked to a lower heat increment. So we split the animals into two groups depending on whether they farrowed in spring or in summer. And the figure here shows how the temperature humidity index changes over the average day in both the spring and the summer periods. And in the table, we can see that the number of days where the THI increased over that critical value of 20 degrees Celsius during the spring and in the summer was essentially no days in spring where it went over that critical threshold, and roughly a third of the days in summer where that threshold was crossed. And this would lead to the pigs experiencing anything between 1 and 16 hours of potential heat stress. So if we move to the next slide, please. Oops. Thank you. So what we found was that litter performance was much better in spring compared to summer, with higher piglet weaning weights. But something that we thought was surprising was that we found no difference in the feed intake between the diets or between the seasons. So we found that the sows were generally unaffected by diet. So the difference between a sow and a gilt, many of you may already know this, but a sow is a female pig that has at least one pregnancy under her belt already, and a gilt is a new mother, first pregnancy. So we found that sows were generally unaffected by diet, whereas the gilts themselves, we found there could be a beneficial effect of providing them with additional protein in the summer months. This is important because in common practice, to offer one diet to both gilts and sows during lactation is quite common. So we found that in the summer, gilts fed a higher protein diet, had a higher litter growth rate, and this resulted in an increased average piglet weaning weight by about, I think it was about 1 kilogram or so per piglet, as shown here in the figure. However, it's important to note that the gilts that were fed high protein also lost more body condition and back fat over that lactation period than those that were fed a standard protein level. So this is a really important consideration, because although it has a benefit for the offspring from that particular pregnancy, longer term, it's likely to lead to impacts on that particular female pig's body condition, her body reserves, and it can lead to delays in estrus and affect future reproductive success as well. So knock-on effects that could potentially affect other future litters as well. So then we moved to look at the fecal output. Perhaps unsurprisingly, if you feed more protein, we found that there was an increase in nitrogen excretion in the fecal material with no effect on nitrogen digestibility. This again is an important consideration with those diets when we're considering the environmental impact as well. So to look at the impact of these diets on the soil nutrient content, soil samples were collected from each paddock, and each paddock was about 16 metres by 16 metres in size. And this was done at the beginning of the experiment and also after the final batch was weaned. So it's important to note that there had been pigs in these pens before, so they weren't virgin use. They'd had pigs in prior to that. So it's not a true standing start. So we sampled soil from these pens from 0 to 10 centimetres depth at 5 different locations, so from each of the corners and then from the centre. And we bulked to form a composite sample for each paddock. So on return to the lab, all the samples were sieved to homogenise the soil. And the samples were then analysed for pH, for soil organic carbon, Olsen P, potassium chloride extractable nitrogen, copper and zinc. And Olsen P we found increased significantly over time, but there was no difference between the different diets. Available nitrogen increased significantly over time overall, but again, the high protein had no significant difference between the diets. Therefore, it wasn't really possible to observe an impact of changes in the fecal nitrogen output on the soil nitrogen content. And there are a number of different reasons why this might be the case, and we'll come to outline that in just a few moments. So across the piece, we found that the pH was neutral at 7.4. There were no significant changes observed in zinc or copper over time or between treatments, and soil organic carbon increased over time in 2 of the treatments, but no differences were seen between the diets overall. So there are many challenges with working with an outdoor experiment of this nature, and I think it's important to point this out at this stage. So there are lots of interacting variables that we need to consider that we can't control. The main one being, of course, the weather conditions. And although we recorded days with temperature humidity index above the critical value for heat stress, there were no longer periods of hot weather observed during the study. So as we were working in line with commercial conditions, the animals used included both gilts and sows. And we know that these animals have different nutritional requirements under normal circumstances. So I think for future reference, I think what we would like to do is split the group into. The PowerPoint seems to have stopped sharing. There is scope to integrate the weather data with outdoor production, but in order to be able to do so, we need to sample far more frequently, so that we can get a more accurate representation of the changes over time. But there were challenges with this, so in terms of the time, the storage and the cost. So we couldn't do everything we wanted to do, isn't that always the way? And so we had to make compromises. And I think for what we've got here, it was it's a preliminary study, and it's given us plenty to think about and consider for future studies. So I'm going to suggest we move to the next slide, but it seems that the presentation's disappeared.
Yes, I'm very sorry. It's something to do with the SharePoint, I think, at Leeds. Just give me, can you just sort of keep talking and I'll play around.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the next work package, which is work package 3. And this work package had the objective of developing precision tools, combining earth observation, machine learning and data analytics to track activity in paddocks, and so track the evolution of risk to both the animals and to soil health. So if you could see the presentation at this point in time, what you would be able to see is an image from about 120 meters up in the sky, looking down on one of our university farm dry sow paddocks. Oh, there we go. So if we, actually, I should just say before we move on to that slide, if we can go back one. So this work was done in collaboration with the computer scientists at the University of Lincoln. Daniel Gilson and myself at the University of Leeds, working closely with Jason Bergen, Lei Zhang and Nigel Allinson at the University of Lincoln. Thank you very much. If we could move on. So as promised, this is an aerial view of our university farm, and you can see the sow arcs in the field below. And what we're doing here is using cameras mounted on drones to develop an activity tracker and to measure soil properties. So next slide, please. Okay, so we recorded video footage using drones flying at 120 meters above the fields in order to capture activity. We have then applied an algorithm that was designed and developed through another one of our ongoing projects, a GFS funded project called Pig Sustain. And in this project, what we designed and developed was a CCTV camera system to detect and track individual pigs indoors 24/7 through light and dark, through all kinds of various different challenging conditions. So high ammonia levels, insects landing on the cameras, that kind of thing. And we have applied the algorithm that we developed for that was originally designed to look for early warning indicators of disease based on activity levels, and have applied it to an outdoor environment with a drone mounted camera instead. And we didn't know at the outset whether this would work, whether we'd be able to track the pigs. I mean, you can see how tiny they are at this height. So we've got a little clip of the video footage embedded in this slide here, and you can see the bright pink dots there surrounding, they're called bounding boxes, they're surrounding each individual pig. So a bounding box appears when the algorithm detects an individual, and it then tracks them continuously for the whole time that the camera footage is being collected. So what it allows us to do is basically look at activity levels over that whole area and combine that with information about soil properties to look at how activity influences soil health. Next slide, please.
Sorry. Where are we?
That one, that's the one. Background slide, thank you. So what you get when you feed this into the algorithm is we can get an output that looks a bit like this heat map here. And I've positioned it like this and sort of sized it like this on the image, because essentially the pigs that are in the top left corner of that field there, next to the 4 arcs, are represented on this heat map as the purple dots. So the size of the dot here is representing activity levels. So for those individuals that are moving around a lot, they would have a much larger circle for each of those individuals. So each dot is one pig. If they move a lot, the circle gets bigger, the dot gets bigger, and if they move very little, the dot gets smaller. And what we can see here is an interesting differentiation. So they've been monitored over a number of days, and this data has been collated and represented in this heat map for those 6 days. And what we can see here is in that top left corner, those pigs are actually late stage pregnancy. And when we look at the figure, the dots are very small. So there's very little activity there. And in the group below, so the second set of 4 arcs below and the pigs that are almost directly below the drone, they're represented by those red dots down at the bottom. And you can see that each individual dot is larger than the ones in the purple up above. And so these individuals down here in that second set, they're very early stage pregnancy. They had only just been serviced. So their activity levels are much higher. So why am I showing you this? I'm showing you because essentially it demonstrates that we can track overall activity with this method. The XYs that you can see here denotes the pixel locations. The video was recorded in 4K, so it's essentially a one-to-one conversion in pixels. And so we can get really accurate representation of what's happening in that field, and then overlay that with other environmental information. So we also have used the drone-mounted camera system to assess soil roughness. And to do this, we took individual pictures of the field every 2 seconds and then stitched those images together to form a 3D image of the soil from above. And we're currently, sorry, I can't show you this, but we're currently assessing that data now in combination with the activity level footage. So hopefully in a matter of weeks, we had hoped to have it ready for you, but very sorry. In a matter of weeks, we should be able to see how the activity maps onto the soil roughness data and whether we can predict soil roughness based on activity patterns in the field. So this would be something really novel. Next slide, please. So I think the key thing that I wanted to pick out here is really that it was amazing to me that we could actually even pick the pigs out when they're so tiny on that image and track them as individuals. But I think the really neat thing that comes out of this is there are a whole series of different potential applications, as well as in this sort of climate-facing research and looking at soil health. So as well as giving us a clearer idea on land use and the impacts on soil health, we can also use it to look at animal health and biosecurity. And of course, this plays into other interesting things such as AMR routes into the environment and the passage of of potential chemical agents through feces into the soil as well. So it would enable us to track and monitor and predict where we might find certain types of toxin. Okay, next slide, please. So moving on to the fourth work package, and this work package is very well linked to the previous work packages, particularly considering the impact of outdoor production on soils. And here we measured soil carbon and nutrient dynamics as a proxy for soil quality, but then also used simulation tools to look at the future and the likely impact over several years of different kinds of rotation practices, including outdoor pigs. So this work was conducted and led by Marcelo Galdos, Ishwar Pun, Pippa Chapman, Steve Dobby, Steve Benwatt, and with input from myself as well, all based at the University of Leeds. Next slide, please. So we started this work package with several years of soil measurements under our belts already. So from previous projects that had been going on at the university farm. So we were able to utilise that data, and we combined it with climate data from the Met Office station at the university farm, and also with UKCR climate projections data to support our modelling on future climate scenarios. So just as an example, if we go to the next slide, please. This is summary data and projections plotted from the Met Office station at Bramham, showing precipitation and temperature measures. And we can see that the average temperature is projected to increase, and rainfall is projected to decrease between 2019 and 2048. Next slide, please. So as far as soil measurement goes, we had 7 pens with pigs in and control plots as well. So the control plots had previously had crop rotations running through them, but at the time of the trial had been set aside. And what we can see from this figure, the first one on the left, is that there's a significant decline in soil organic matter over time, over the time that the pigs were in the pens, compared with the control areas. And we also see that available nitrogen was significantly higher in the pens, and we see the same for phosphorus levels also. And particularly for phosphorus, that this increased over the full observation time, so between 2018 and 2020. And of course, with the loss in organic matter, the relative increase in nitrogen and phosphorus is problematic because it exposes potential vulnerability to losses of these nutrients. Next slide, please. So this figure shows the total available nitrogen from before the pigs were introduced to the pen, when winter wheat was originally growing in the field, so back in 2018. And at this point, that it had nitrogen applied as a fertiliser. Then moving forwards to sort of early 2019 or late 2018, when the pigs were first introduced to the area, and going forwards in time through to early 2020. And during this time, we took field measurements, and we can see here how these observations fall reasonably neatly in line with what our simulations predicted. Although I think it's worth noting that, again, there aren't that many observation periods. It would be very beneficial to have more frequent samples collected here, just to have that little bit more confidence in the simulations. But what we do have, we can see does fall in line with what we were expecting. So we can see that the control pen levels are low. The total available nitrogen is low compared with the pen levels. But it's important to note, there are no crops there to use that nitrogen up. So potentially this could ultimately lead to losses in through leaching to groundwater and nitrous oxide emissions. So this would be particularly a risk in the autumn and winter as the soil gets wetter. So it's just something for us to bear in mind. Next slide, please. So next we looked at what happens over a longer time series with soil organic carbon using the DayCent model, and we calibrated the model to get a starting point for how much carbon there is in the first 20 centimetres of soil. And then from that point, when the pigs were introduced, we simulated a number of different possible scenarios, so farming practice scenarios. So the 4 scenarios presented is firstly in green, the arable rotation without pigs. And we compared this with 2 years pigs, 4 years arable. That's the purple line. 12 months pigs, 12 months grass, 4 years cereal, which is the sort of the navy blue line. And then 6 months pigs, 6 months grass, 6 months pigs, 6 months grass, 4 years cereal, which is the red line. So what we can see here quite clearly is that this final scenario that includes keeping the pigs for much shorter durations as part of that rotation leads to much higher levels of soil organic carbon than the other livestock rotation scenarios that we tested. And we can see that with our current management systems that we have in place, where we keep them on a 6-year rotation, we can expect to see much further decreases in soil organic carbon over time, unless we make a substantial change. So it'll be important for us to explore further the impact of extreme weather events on the soil under these different scenarios. So that's the next step for us, and exploring further what control strategies can then be put in place to prevent against deterioration of soil health through these periods of potential drought and flooding. Next slide, please. So I've added in here two images, so projected climate change from RCP 8.5, firstly looking at the mean air temperature under the 12 different models, and I think the key thing here, if we just click so that the circle appears, there we go, it's not really a circle, the oval appears, so thanks. So I've highlighted here where the key areas in the UK are for pig farming, and I think, and particularly where we might expect to have some concerns in the future based on projections for temperature and for rainfall, which we're going to see in the next slide, as far as pig production goes. So we've seen that there are issues with higher temperatures and potential rainfall as well, as far as the environmental impact goes. And so, you know, when we look at the figures here, we can see that for the eastern parts of the UK in particular, you know, down in the southeast, around East Anglia, there is a risk in some of the models, particularly down on this bottom row, where the southeast and East Anglia heats up to a greater extent. We might expect to see, yes, thanks, Kate. We might expect to see more issues arising here with associated with higher temperatures for production, whereas we see a relatively smaller increase in sort of the northern parts and Scotland. And if we move to the next slide.
Lisa, sorry, we've got about 1 more minute left.
Yep, I'm nearly done.
Okay.
Next slide, projected impacts. We see again that there is a potential for increasing precipitation, particularly down in that southeast quarter, where we also get we also have a very high proportion of our outdoor production. Next slide, please. So just to finalise the messages really. So our key messages were that we have lots of interacting variables to consider in outdoor production, such as individual pig requirements, the presence and absence of extreme weather during the trial periods that we've been looking at, the sampling resolution so that we can fully integrate with weather data in the way that we would really like to be able to, and be able to spot the patterns that we suspect are there. And the challenges that we've identified with soil sampling as well, such as the distribution of the faecal material around the pen and straw in the pen as well, and the sampling regime as well. So again, around how often these things are sampled and processed, which obviously increases drastically the cost of the trial. We found that soil organic carbon decreased when outdoor pigs were introduced into an arable rotation in the current management system that we operate, and that nutrient buildup in soils without the crops can lead to losses to the environment. So there is an opportunity identified here to explore a range of management options to mitigate, and we've started that process now, and we'll be continuing with that over the coming years. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention and invite Steve Irwin from Karro Food Group to share his thoughts with you.